Yeah, see how it is
Whee!
right off the bat.
Oh, hey.
Hello, everyone, and welcome, and thanks so much for coming out tonight. I'm Michael Goodson, and I'm the curator here at the Contemporary Dayton, and I'd like to actually recognize a few folks and institutions that have supported this trio of shows, which is to say Odile Donald Odita and Jeffrey Gibson and Heather Jones. And I'd like to thank the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Dayton who supported these three shows, Susan Strong and Bob Pohl, and Dr. Robert L. Brandt Jr., who supported the education outreach for these three exhibitions, and Mitosis, who is actually running the production of this talk tonight and who does all of our video talks, and they've been a great partner for us. So thank you to all of those people and institutions. I'd also like to make you aware that we have another opening coming up on Thursday, May 5th, 6-ish, and that is Beverly Fishman with New Works and George Rush in Gallery B with 200 paintings, and Mary Reed Kelly and Patrick Kelly both in the video room and in the small gallery adjacent to it with work that was commissioned just last year for the Fabric Workshop in Philadelphia. So please come on May 5th. After the talk tonight, Paige Beller will be playing a set of music, so please stay around for that. Yeah, Paige is great. And we're going to go for just about 30 minutes, and then we'll do like a short Q&A. That microphone there in the center of the room is what you should step up to ask your questions. You will be recorded for all eternity. But don't be shy. So tonight we are talking with Heather Jones, whose work we are amid in this gallery. Heather is a native Cincinnatian and studied art at the University of Cincinnati's College of Design, Art, Architecture, and Planning, earning a bachelor's degree there and a master's degree. She currently lives in Springboro, Ohio, which is a small town sort of between Dayton and Cincinnati, on a small farm with her family. She is represented by David Richard Gallery in New York, Contemporary Art Matters, Rebecca Ebel's Gallery in Columbus, Ohio, the George Galleries in Charleston, South Carolina, and Mormon Galleries in Louisville, Kentucky, and Slate Contemporary in Oakland, California. That's a lot to manage, I would assume. She has a rich residency resume, but I think the one that stands out for just about everyone who experiences the work and the ideas is she was in the first residency, the first class in Candy Wiley's Black Rock in Senegal, Africa. That was in 2019. She has recent shows include Black Rock, Beyond Black Rock at Contemporary Art Matters in Columbus, A Sense of Place at the Weston Galleries in Cincinnati, Convergence at Mormon Galleries in Louisville, Kentucky, and To Hold Tender This Land at David Richard Gallery in New York, which just closed. It was a really beautiful exhibition. And Storytellers, which is the show that you're sitting in currently. So Heather is an artist. I'm going to actually give credit here to Heather herself, because really what I'm reading is her artist statement. That's why it sounds so smart, not because it came from my mind, but rather hers. Heather Jones is an artist who uses abstraction, color to comment on historical, socio-political relationships between women and textiles, and explores the relationship between gender, place, time, and culture in her work. Her practice continues the story of geometric abstraction inherent in women's patchwork found in southern Appalachian regions of the U.S., and her work is steeped in the history of quilt making, and she chooses to work with fabric rather than paint, which is very important to me because it acts as an expansive idea on what the idea of a painting actually is, which I have a really ecumenical view about. A painting is, for me, is more about what you're seeing than any process. And with that, I'd like to just welcome Heather Jones. So this show for me is so much about the exploration of histories, the history of women's work, the history of quilting, histories that include African American quilting and Appalachian quilting. And so I'd like to start actually with none of those and talk about your personal history with this work and this process.
Okay.
What can you tell me about that?
So, no one in my immediate family quilted. Like, I did not grow up watching my mom quilt, my grandmother quilt. You know, they were busy having kids, taking care of the house. But there was one woman in my family that quilted that I know of, and that was my great-great-aunt, Ollie. She was born in eastern Kentucky, kind of near Berea, if you're familiar with the area, in, I think, 1897. And she was my mom's dad's aunt. So when I was born in 76, you know, if you do the math, she was in her 80s, she made me a baby quilt that I still have to this day. And I actually knew my great-great-aunt Ollie a little bit. She lived with my grandparents for a few years. And so, I mean, I was a child. She died when I was about 6. But I kept this thing. I've always loved handmade objects. And so I think as I got older, this idea of, you know, the fact that this woman in her 80s, I was not her grandchild, I was not her great-grandchild, I was just a baby in the family, but she took it upon herself at the ripe old age of, 82 or whatever she was, and made this quilt by hand. And so, I don't know, that's always meant a lot to me personally. And I started buying quilts when I was in high school. I would go to antique stores. I loved them as objects. Like, I really was drawn to them, I think to their, the graphic nature, the colors, the shapes, but also just as an object. And I would think, you know, there was probably some little old lady somewhere that made this. So I would search them out, and I have amassed, you know, kind of a hefty collection of them now. And I don't use them. They're just, I pull them out every once in a while. But I mean, I really think it was those two things that sort of solidified my admiration for the art of quilt making.
Yeah, the other personal thing that I discovered about your relationship to this process was entirely connected to being at your studio. And it's a thing that you have to, I think, have been at your studio to completely understand. But while there's no paint involved in these paintings, it is exactly like a painter's studio in that there is fabric and color everywhere.
Right.
So it's like if you're in Carrie Moyer's studio, there's acrylic paint everywhere, and if you're in Amy Silman's studio, there's everything everywhere, and it looks like a painter's studio with fabric replacing paint.
And I used to paint. I mean, back 20 years ago, I used to paint with real paint. But I really, and I kind of laugh at that too, but to me they are paintings, and I try to use fabric in place of paint. But I really started to work with textiles when I had kids. My husband and I had our first child in 2006, and then we had our second 18 months later. So I had 2 babies underfoot, and while that was an amazing, incredible, time of our lives, it was also very tiring, as you could probably imagine. But so I really turned to working with textiles as a result, I think, of having the 2 kids back to back, because it allowed me to have a creative practice. It wasn't feasible for me to paint, to continue painting, or using more traditional materials, I would say, in a creative way. with 2 babies. But I set up a spot in our dining room. I had a sewing machine. And I was making things for them too. I mean, I made baby quilts for my children. I didn't know what I was doing. I just sort of put things together. And I sort of think I approached the quilts that I actually made, like the actual quilts that I made, with the eyes of a painter. Just interested in color and shape, not necessarily like a traditional quilt pattern. But I also soon found when I had 2 children, under the age of 2, that I could have a stack of fabric in the corner of my dining room. And if they were sleeping at the same time, or if they were, as they got a little bit older, playing together, I could do something for 15 minutes. And I think that little burst of, creative energy that was, sort of to help me deal with everything else that was going on. It was a way for me really just to have that, that continuous like creative practice that I could no longer sustain with 2 young children. So that really led me to want to work with textiles. I think, every once in a while I'll still paint, but I'm reminded how messy it is. Like, I don't know that I could ever go back to painting full time, because the beauty of, to me, one of the beauty of working with textiles, the way I do, you'll have threads. I'll have threads on me, but, I don't have to put on special clothes. There's not a lot of cleanup involved in terms of like washing out brushes. So I think those years of being at home with my kids really informed my practice that it is today.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting in that it's, for me, this show specifically, but really all 3 shows that kind of speak to one another, they approach pattern, color, I would argue rhythm, from 3 different perspectives, but what ends up happening is that you don't sort of end up dwelling on the dichotomies, but rather on the commonalities. So it wasn't something that I figured out until we almost had the show hung,
right,
if you will, but what ends up happening is these 3 different perspectives speak to what is common in those histories. So, and what Odile and what Jeffrey do in terms of history is very different, I would say, than what you do in terms of history.
Sure.
And I love the way that among the things that's woven into this kind of plait of histories, if you will, is your personal history. Not only the history of your family, but the most recent history of your immediate family that has driven the process and
right,
practice. And that's kind of fascinating to me.
Yeah.
So the work has a vista quality. So you walk in this gallery and it's beautiful, but what's great is that vista sort of keeps unfolding and unfolding and unfolding, and if you care to look deeply enough and read a little bit, you know about the histories that are being explored.
right.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about the quilting histories, which are more arcane and less known. What specific quilting histories have you looked at, been fascinated by? What's affecting the process?
Yeah, I think obviously my personal family history, like we mentioned, Aunt Ollie did come up to Ohio, as I mentioned, in like the 20s to look for jobs. And she, I think obviously, again, I never spoke with her about her quilts, but I have to imagine that she was taught how to quilt out of necessity, right? She was from eastern rural Kentucky. But what's fascinating to me is, while she probably learned this as a young girl, she continued this throughout her life. And so we have, my mom and I have quilts that she made over her lifetime. She made one for my mom when she graduated from high school. So just that whole idea of, continuing to do this, even when you don't need to do it out of, literally a way to keep warm, but this became something that she did and enjoyed throughout her age. I'm also greatly inspired by the work of the quilters of Gee's Bend. And they, seeing that show, because at that point when I saw their work, I was not working in textiles at that point in my life. But my husband, who is also a painter, saw the original one, I think it was at the Whitney, in 2002. And he called me from the streets of New York and he said, "You have to see this show. You will freak out." Because I loved, I had this soft spot, right, for quilts. And so it actually traveled to Cleveland in 2002, and we drove 4 hours from Cincinnati to see that show. And like that, I mean, if I talk about it too long, I might cry, because it was one of those moments in my life that, you know, you walk into this gallery and you see these beautiful objects, right, that were made not by, or not with fabric that was, you know, purchased. It was leftover clothing. It was, you know, the jeans of a woman's husband who, when he passed away, this is what she did. And for me, as especially with my experience as an art historian, you know, seeing those works on the wall, I saw echoes of, you know, heroic painting of the 50s, fine art, right, by men, primarily men. But it was just fascinating to me to see sort of this continuous creative force that drove these women, primarily women, to make this work. So, you know, that's certainly another one of those.
Can you talk just a little bit about Gee's Bend specifically, just so people know?
Sure. I mean, I hope you're familiar with them. If not, please look them up. But it's a very rural part of Alabama, and it's sort of accompanied, or it's sort of encircled by a river. So it's very isolated, and there's a strong, rich history of women quilters in the area who, you know, they were enslaved peoples on the plantation there, and then after the end of slavery, a lot of them stayed. And so that history of quilt making is still going on today. And their work is, I mean, it's beyond, just, it's magnificent.
Yeah, so that was a seminal moment for you.
It was, it really was, because, you know, I liked looking at quilts, I liked collecting them, but the whole act of making a quilt seemed very intimidating to me, because to me, to make them usable, they're large, I thought everything had to be precise and perfect, and that was the beauty of looking at the work by the women of Gee's Bend. The imperfections were really what spoke to me, and even in the antique quilts that I own, like, the imperfections are what speaks to me. So, I mean, to me, like, they are much more beautiful than many paintings out there.
Well, the other, it's really funny, I think people tend to think of it in terms of low and high, which I think is
Right.
A bad start, essentially, because it's all actually high. But the men that you speak of, I mean, I think of Kenneth Nolan and artists like that, but I also think of Alma Thomas and other artists that don't necessarily fit the Stella Nolan thing of geometric abstraction.
Right.
But this is another history that's folded into all of the histories that's being explored in the show.
Right.
And that's what's fascinating about it to me. It's just basically, it's an exploration of often seemingly dichotomous histories that all actually fit together beautifully, because they really are ultimately about the same thing. It was funny, just yesterday I was talking to an artist here in town named Bridget Bogle, who makes this amazing work, and I think the conversation went everywhere, but it ended up alighting on this thing of the work being about just the act of being alive. There's like this baseline quotidian thing of how you deal with your days. And I think Gee's Bend reflects that. And in researching the history of quilting and craft, I tried desperately to find an Eastern European and Jewish quilting history, and there isn't really one, but it's slightly different. It's a sewing history, just not a terribly graphic one. It's more about functional things, blankets, making things that work. But the other history that's being explored is this incredibly deep history of women's work,
Right.
Which is a really interesting term.
It is.
I'm not sure how comfortable anyone is with it, to be honest with you, but talk to me a little bit about how deeply feminist the work is in terms of its reckoning with the history of women's work.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I've written about this a little bit, but, you know, the fact that, I mean, I can make these with paint. And I did try to make them with paint. But for me, I didn't enjoy the process of working with paint in this way, because when I painted, a long time ago, my work was very different than what you see on the walls today. It was very much representational, it was realistic, it was narrative, I would say. But so I am purposely choosing to work with fabric. Obviously my children are older now. I could stand to get messy in the studio. But to me, working with something that is ready-made, working with something that has a history in and of itself, the, cotton fabric that I use, the history that's associated with it speaks to me, I think, conceptually, much more so than paint would. So, I think by purposely choosing material to work with, that is so, in our culture, I feel like so inherently tied to women and issues of domesticity. And, I think, especially the cultures, I would say, from the Appalachian region, they primarily didn't have time, resources to be creative just for the sake of being creative, right? Like, it was the work that they were producing, the quilts that they were making were done, number one, out of function, but number two, out of a way to express their creativity. You think of these traditional American quilt patterns like the log cabin, flying geese. These were all things that these women saw in their everyday lives, but they were using those elements of daily life as sort of starting points for creativity. But it wasn't making things just to be creative, it was making things that served a purpose. So that whole idea of function and form and necessity and want all sort of fascinate me, how they sort of culminate in quilts, especially from the Appalachian region, I would say.
Well, other people have explored the history of quote-unquote women's work in various ways, and I would cite maybe even Gada Amir, who introduced this idea of sewing as a painting process. But I think your understanding of your material is also a huge part of this, which isn't present in a lot of those explorations. So one of the things that fascinates me the most, or that initially drew me into the idea of the work, was your understanding of cotton itself, and how there is this very slight painterly thing that occurs when you manipulate the bias, the weave of the cotton.
Right.
And that's as fascinating to me as a painter's understanding of paint. Just to mention an artist that I mentioned earlier, Amy Solman, once told me that blindfolded, if you put cadmium red and a white paint in her left and her right hand, she could tell you by the weight of it what it was. That's the depth of her understanding of oil paint. Like, she understands, and I think what she said to me, which actually comes to bear in your work, is that it would be like wearing a t-shirt on a winter's day, if you used the paint improperly. And your understanding, so, we're in front of this painting, for instance, and you look at this really subtle, sinuous line that occurs in the patterns, and that's really about an understanding of what's going to happen when those seams are pulled.
Right, yeah. So the process is, I basically, I don't dye fabric. I think we talked about that. It's all pre-dyed. I buy it from a manufacturer, cut it up with scissors or something called a rotary cutter. Then I use a sewing machine, stitch it together. I use an iron to make everything nice and flat. So a lot of my techniques are those of a quilt maker, yet these are not quilts. So I think that's an important, distinction to make. But you're right, so the cotton fabric I use is woven, so there's warp and weft, and the threads go, sort of at perpendicular angles. And so, for instance, a garment maker, if you were making clothing, you would cut the fabric a certain way so that it doesn't stretch. So this is 100% cotton that you see in the work. There's no spandex or anything that's inherently stretchy. But if you cut the fabric on a bias, so sort of diagonal to that warp and weft, it stretches just as that's its nature. So I play with that a lot in the compositions that I make because I don't want things to appear rigid. This is my way of like sort of making an organic line out of something that is not so organic, right? It's more structured. But also I know as this fabric is pulled tightly, because then these are all wrapped over wooden panels. So as that fabric is pulled taut and stapled into place on the back, seams shift as a result of that bias, the bias nature of the fabric. So it's always a little bit of a surprise to me what they look like when they're finished. I have a good idea, but I can't control what's going to stretch. I can't control how tugging one end of the fabric is going to affect the overall composition. So I welcome those elements of chance, like those surprise things that happen, because to me, that just sort of adds a little bit of excitement. It's, it's out of my control. It's not something that I can dictate what is going to happen. So those little elements of surprise, I welcome, and I actually get really excited when those little subtle shifts happen.
Yeah, and for me, it pushes it so patently into the realm of painting. But there's also other manipulations, like all of these works have 4 panels
Yeah.
that are have an ultimate decided rhythm.
Right.
And I've seen the works sort of disassemble
Right.
and reassemble different ways.
Right.
And there's that part of it as well.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
almost is like a model for me anyway for the various histories that are being explored too.
Yeah.
Because normally a quilt has this sort of indelible thing that's passed down through generations.
Right.
So it tells a kind of a story over huge swaths of time.
Right.
And there are a couple things about this process that sort of addresses that in a really fast way, which has more of an affiliation to painting than it does to quilting, but it becomes very blurry, right?
Right, right.
And I think the blur is what I love
Yeah.
about it.
Well, I
and
do
it's what I
too.
was drawn to.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know, I am fascinated by particularly, handmade traditions that are passed down from generation to generation and how they change over time, and not just quilt making, like, all sorts of handiwork, how they change over time, how they remain the same, cross-culturally, what kind of influence from one place, how they blend, especially how they blended in our country, all those ideas really fascinate me, and I feel like they're certainly explored in my work as well.
Is it, do you think I'm curious about the propriety of my perception that it's kind of a shorthand for all this history, both painting and quilting.
Yeah, no, for sure.
So is that, in your estimation, an accurate?
Yeah, I think so,
Yeah,
for sure.
I love the shorthand quality of that
Yeah,
as well.
thank you.
Which also has more of an affiliation with contemporary painting. Well, actually modern painting too. I mean,
Yeah.
it's gestural in
Yep.
its nature.
Yep.
Although I would argue that these are really designed things.
I think they're both. I mean, I think they're designed and gestural. And just like anything, the more time you spend looking at something, you'll see more, right? But I don't hide the fact that they're fabric. I mean, there's little bits of dark that will pop out. There's little threads that you see. And to me, those become gesture marks, right? Those become drawn lines. I mean, there are certain limitations working this way. While I touch physically every piece of fabric that creates the composition, I'm not using my hands to make a mark like a painter would, right? Or a drawer would. So those sort of like chances where I can let sort of the history of its construction come through, to me, act as like gesture marks, or as, maybe underpainting that would happen in a traditional painting.
Yeah, it's a funny conversation too, because
Yeah.
I think when you start talking about painting as a formal thing, it starts to become only interesting to painters. And
True.
what's really
Right.
fascinating about this work, and it's a thing that I'm guilty of.
Yeah.
I've done it over and over.
Yeah.
But and it's because I'm just fascinated by painting.
Yeah.
But I think the really great thing about this work is that it's super egalitarian in that so many people can appreciate it on so many levels. You don't have to deconstruct every history that's, no pun intended, woven into these
Right.
paintings.
Right.
To just understand the very human qualities of color and pattern
Yeah.
and rhythm.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, the rhythm part was kind of an epiphany for me, and it happened quite literally when we turned on the Jeffrey Gibson video, which was kind of late in the process of the
Right.
installation of the show. And I will say that Jeffrey Gibson's inclusion in the show was entirely, in my estimation, your idea. Like, we talked about a lot of work, and
Yeah.
you had told me that, you know, the show at Sycamore Jenkins in New York was
Yeah.
really fascinating to you, and
Yes.
so I started chasing it up.
Yep.
And so thanks
Thank
for
you.
that.
Yeah.
And
I think it makes sense. I mean, I just think it's, I don't know, to me, there's this really strong trio of work here.
yeah.
So
and-
thank you.
Well, I think there was that risk that at a certain, I'm super neurotic, so like at a certain point, I'm always worried that something is going to go horribly awry in the idea of the show. So maybe too matchy or
Right,
something like that.
Right.
But I do think that the works speak to each other.
Yeah,
and,
no, they do.
What was really fascinating, though, was that idea of rhythm entering the greater idea of the show by the inclusion of Jeffrey's work.
Yeah.
So, and I had never thought about that as being a quality of painting necessarily.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I suppose it occurs throughout the history of painting, though. There's
Yeah.
rhythm in throughout the history of painting. Like the rhythm of El Greco is different than the rhythm of, I don't know, Diebenkorn or
Sure,
something. But
yeah.
I think that, you know, the inclusion, that idea that was your idea, really did bring out this other element to the show.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, we're at this point where, because we're trying more and more to make these talks kind of palatable online, quite honestly. It's sad but true.
For sure.
Actually, maybe not so sad. I don't know. Let's kind of wrap it up with a Q&A, if that's cool with everyone here.
Sure.
I have created a distinctive path to this mic that's in the middle of the room. So I would encourage anyone who has a question to come to the mic.
Hi.
Hey.
Hi, I'm Hannah.
Hi.
I drove down from Columbus.
Oh, thanks for making
the
the
show
trip.
looks really great.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about those compositional strategies and thinking about the irregularities you were bringing up with the G's Ben quilts.
Yeah.
And you're talking about that in terms of the warping with the patterns. And there's also a lot of irregularity with the pattern constructions too.
Right.
And I wanted to maybe hear a little bit about how you set up a process for yourself in constructing pattern, and if you also like offer moments of like wandering within that beginning process of figuring out how to put these together.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I sometimes start in sketchbooks. I do love the paper and pencil, old school, not anything computerized, but an actual sketchbook. And so there's a lot of triangles in this show. I've been working a lot with triangles for like the past couple years, and not perfectly aligned triangles, right? Some of them are cut off, some of them are cut in half, some of them are chopped off at the top. So in my studio, I have a large wall that's covered in flannel. And so my process is almost collage-like in the fact that I usually buy fabric, yardage of fabric, and then I cut it down into smaller shapes. A lot of times it's squares or rectangles. And on that flannel wall, I can, it's kind of magic. Like you just put the piece of cotton fabric on the flannel and it sticks, and I don't know why it does, but it does, without tape, without pins, without anything. So I often lay out compositions that way. So I'll create something that is exciting to me, that I like, and then once I'm sort of happy with that composition, then it's, you know, taking it piece by piece and sort of figuring out how to construct this thing, then how to go from, you know, individual pieces on a wall to then how do I then engineer it so that it all comes together. And sometimes in that process, I would say, you know, what I have up on the wall is pretty similar to what it looks like in the end, without that stretching that happens, right? Or those little shifts that happen when I stretch it. And then sometimes you think like, well, that's just garbage and let's just stop. And the beauty too about working with this way, you know, a painter can obviously paint over their canvases, right? I can't do that, but I can cut up my fabric and re-put it together. So very little is wasted. So I can always, there's really no bits that are too small. So it's just, I've got in my studio like kind of these mounds of containers of fabric that just are left over from other projects or sort of kind of rejects, right? Like the pile that didn't work out so well. So there is both, I would say, like planning, but I don't, when I say planned, it's not, I don't measure out precisely. It's all, to me, that's not fun. And I feel like my work is very intuitive, so I'm not relying on precise measuring. And those are those, through this like imperfect construction, that's where those elements of interest, I think, happen, because everything doesn't line up, everything doesn't match up. And to me, that harkens back to those antique quilts that I have, where my favorite parts are the imperfections. Like maybe she ran out of this fabric and she had to substitute it with this, or maybe this block is a little wonky because it got washed 100 times, right? Because it got used for years. So it's like those little elements of, I think, things that influence my work. That's what I'm trying to create in those imperfect moments. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Rebecca. So beautiful shows together, and it feels like a celebration of American art, and in a way that's not necessarily inspired by our Western European forefathers, and looking at both American, Native American histories, African American histories.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you could talk about that a little bit, and because I feel like the light and color, and especially in this show, your last show at the Westin was all black and white,
Right,
and
right.
really celebrating that
Right.
modulation. But you seem to find inspiration in something different here with the patterning and the triangles.
Right.
And I'm guessing it's not a nautical inspiration.
It's not. No, I would not say it's overtly nautical. I think a lot of the geometric things, like the sort of the busyness in some of these patterns, were from my time that I spent in Dakar. I was in Dakar, Senegal in October of 2019. You know, that it's like the before times, right? Like it was, it feels like another world, another time. But during the residency that you mentioned. So I was there and I took a lot of photos of just people on the street, in the markets, the garments that people wore, you know, these bright, beautiful colors, a lot of African wax, or sorry, Dutch wax fabric, you know, that had these intricate patterns. I also was fascinated with something I saw in a museum there, and it was these, there was mud cloth, but it had this geometric patterns on it. And that has sort of, I think, stayed in my mind. So even though obviously these are not, I would say, identical to the things I saw while I was there, I think certainly the bright colors, the more repetition of pattern and shape certainly are reflective of that experience. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Well, thanks so much for talking with us and talking about the work, and thanks for the work.
Thank you.
And thanks for being part of what we're trying to do here at the Co, which is basically celebrate art that is made in Ohio, along with art that kind of reflects the larger ecology of the art world. And I think that you are interesting in that you sort of are both. Currently, there's a lot of attention being paid to your work, and thanks for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I will mention one more thing that I didn't mention at the beginning, and that is on April 29th, the last Friday in April, is our annual art auction, which is a huge fundraiser for us, and it's also just a fascinating evening and a really, really fun evening. So please come out on April 29th to our art auction. Thanks for coming tonight, though. Thanks a lot.